Welcome back, guys, to Wrong Turn Horror. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true, terrifying stories from abandoned houses in Appalachia. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new horror story. Now, let's step into the forgotten houses of Appalachia, where dust hides secrets, silence echoes louder than screams, and shadows never quite leave. In the foothills of eastern Kentucky, just past the old mining town of Harlan, there's a stretch of road most people don't like to talk about. Locals call it Pine Hollow Road. On maps, it's just a thin gray line curving through the hills, winding past overgrown cemeteries, rusted-out cars, and sagging barns. But deep in those woods, leaning against the mountainside like it's struggling to hold itself up, stands a house that hasn't had a living family inside it for nearly 50 years. People say if you're foolish enough to drive Pine Hollow at night, your headlights will catch a glimpse of it through the trees. The windows are empty, black like hollow eyes, and the porch sags in the middle as if something heavy once sat there, waiting. Everyone in town knows the stories. They say no one's lived there since the early 70s, when the coal company pulled out and the families left behind either packed up or wasted away. That house in particular belonged to a man who lost his children in a fire. After that night, no one ever saw him again. Some say he wandered into the mines and never came back. Others say he never really left. Charles, a man in his 40s who grew up hearing whispers about Pine Hollow, decided one autumn evening to go and see it for himself. He wasn't the type who believed in ghosts, at least not until that night. The air was sharp with the smell of fallen leaves when he parked his truck on the shoulder and started walking down the gravel lane. Every step crunched loud in the silence, too loud, like the trees themselves were listening. The closer he got, the more the woods seemed to tighten around him, branches tangling overhead, shadows thickening even though the moon hung bright above the ridges. When he finally reached the clearing, the house loomed ahead. The paint had peeled away in long gray strips, boards warped and split from years of rain. The windows on the second floor were smashed, jagged teeth of glass still clinging to the frames. But what unsettled Charles most wasn't the ruin of the place. It was the feeling that it was expecting him. He stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under his weight, the kind of deep, shuddering groan that echoes up from the bones of a house. The front door stood half open, dark inside like a throat. Pushing gently, he slipped in. The smell hit him first. Damp rot, mold, and something sweet, too sweet like spoiled fruit. His flashlight beam cut across peeling wallpaper and a staircase that sagged toward the middle. Dust coated everything, thick as ash. And yet, right by the door, lined up neatly as if they'd been placed there yesterday, sat a row of children's shoes. Tiny leather boots, scuffed sneakers with laces tied, even a pair of small, worn church shoes, their straps buckled tight. Charles froze. Those shoes should have been eaten by time long ago. But they weren't. They were waiting. He moved carefully, trying not to breathe too loud. His light swept across the parlor where a couch slumped in the corner, springs jutting out. Faded photographs still hung crooked on the wall, their faces blurred with age, though one picture, a family of 4, father, mother, 2 children, looked clearer than it should have. The boy in the photo had the same kind of sneakers Charles had just seen by the door. His boots scuffed the floor as he moved toward the stairs, and with each step, the silence seemed to grow heavier, pressing against his chest. Upstairs, he found the bedrooms. The first was stripped bare, nothing but a broken dresser and a bed frame with its mattress long gone. The second was stranger. Faded wallpaper with little trains still clinging to the wall, a toy truck overturned in the corner. And in the center of the room, a rocking chair. It was moving, slowly, gently, back and forth, though the air in the room was dead still. Charles froze in the doorway, the beam of his flashlight trembling across the chair. At first he thought maybe he'd bumped the floorboards, set it moving by accident. But the longer he stared, the more he realized it wasn't stopping. It was as if someone invisible was sitting there, rocking slowly, patiently. The air turned colder. His skin prickled. He heard it then, a faint sound, low and raspy, like a whisper carried from the corner. He couldn't make out the words, not at first. He strained his ears, and then it became clear. 2 words. Don't forget us. His blood turned to ice. The whisper wasn't behind him. It wasn't in front of him. It was inside the room, curling around him from every corner. Charles stumbled back, nearly tripping over the threshold. The rocking chair kept moving, creaking with every sway. Faster now. He turned, bolted down the stairs, boots thudding against wood that moaned and shifted under his weight. As he hit the bottom, the whisper followed him, louder now, layered, as though more than one voice spoke the same words together. Don't forget us. He ran through the front door, down the porch steps, into the night. His flashlight beam bounced wildly off the trees as he sprinted for the truck. Behind him, he swore he heard the rocking chair slam against the floor, as though it had been shoved over. He didn't look back. When he reached his truck, he fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. The woods were dead silent, except for his ragged breathing. Finally, the engine roared to life. He threw it into gear, gravel spitting as he tore down Pine Hollow Road without daring to glance at the rearview mirror. Later, when he told the story, he admitted something that chilled everyone who heard it. He said the whisper didn't stop once he left the house. It followed him all the way home, faint but clear, a voice curling in the back of his skull whenever he turned off the lights at night. For weeks, he woke in the dark, heart pounding, convinced someone was sitting at the foot of his bed, rocking slowly, whispering, "Don't forget us." Some say Charles lost his mind. Others believe he brushed too close to something in that house that never wanted to be left alone. To this day, the shoes still sit by the door, untouched, waiting for anyone foolish enough to walk in. And if you ever find yourself on Pine Hollow Road and the night feels colder than it should, don't go inside. Because once you hear the whisper, it may never let you go. If you wander deep into the hollows of Fayette County, West Virginia, you'll eventually stumble upon a cabin that looks more like a scar than a home. Locals call it the widow's cabin, and they'll tell you it doesn't belong to the living anymore. The stories say a woman once lived there alone after a mining explosion took her husband and sons. She never left that cabin, not even to fetch water from the creek. They say she boarded up the windows, locked the doors, and let the world forget about her. But the cabin didn't die with her. It's still there, tucked into a valley where the sunlight struggles to reach. From the trail, you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking carefully. The roof slouches under the weight of years, and vines crawl up the logs like veins wrapping around bone. But at night, when the fog rolls down from the ridge and the crickets fall silent, some swear you'll see a light flicker from within, the faint glow of a lantern swaying back and forth in the boarded-up window. That's what drew 2 hikers there one summer evening. Their names were Andy and Luke, college kids from out of state, wandering through the trails of Appalachia looking for ghost stories to brag about. They'd heard whispers about the widow's cabin at a gas station when an old man told them, "Don't go down Pine Lick Hollow. She's still in there, and she don't take kindly to visitors." Of course, being young and arrogant, they laughed it off. That night, with the moon thin and sharp above the trees, they went looking. The hollow was quiet, unnaturally so. The only sound was the crunch of their boots in the undergrowth and the occasional drip of water sliding off the leaves. They found the cabin half hidden under shadow, its outline jagged against the trees. The boards across the windows were weathered but solid, like someone had nailed them with intention. "Dude, it's just a shack," Andy whispered, though his voice betrayed the unease already rising in him. Luke grinned, pulling out his phone. "Then let's get a video. Prove this old guy was full of it." They circled the cabin, brushing past ferns and briars. When they came to the front door, they noticed something strange. Though the doorframe sagged and the hinges were rusted, the padlock on it looked new. Shiny metal, gleaming even in the dim moonlight. It was as if someone or something still locked the cabin from the outside, determined to keep what was inside from getting out. Andy shivered, but tried to play it cool. "Probably just some squatter," he muttered. "Someone living here off the grid." But when they walked around to the back, everything changed. Through the slats of a boarded-up window, Andy saw it first, a faint, golden glow, swaying gently as if carried by hand. He stopped dead. Luke, seeing his frozen expression, leaned closer to peek through the gap. And that's when he saw her. The lantern's glow revealed a face just inches from a crack. Pale, gaunt, hollow-eyed. A woman, or what had once been a woman, staring directly back at him. Her hair hung in thin strands, matted to her cheeks, and her lips were cracked and colorless. Her eyes, though, they glowed faintly, reflecting the lantern light, wide and unblinking. Luke stumbled backward so fast he tripped into the dirt. Andy yanked him up, heart hammering, but before they could speak, the boards rattled violently, as though someone inside was clawing at them, trying to push them free. The lantern light grew brighter, flickering madly, casting shadows that stretched long and unnatural across the hollow. And then, from behind the door, came a sound that froze them both where they stood. A soft, steady creak. The front door was opening. Andy grabbed Luke's arm. Run. They bolted into the woods, branches slashing at their arms, roots snagging their boots. Behind them, they heard the door groan wide open. Neither of them dared to look back, but both swore they felt eyes on their necks, following them through the darkness. When they finally burst back onto the trail and into the safety of the moonlight, the sound stopped. The woods fell silent again, as though nothing had happened. But when Andy risked a glance behind him, he saw something that turned his stomach cold. The cabin door was closed, padlocked again. Weeks later, when they told their story online, people accused them of lying, of chasing thrills with tall tales. But Andy never laughed about it again. He confessed in private that the worst part wasn't what they saw that night. It was what followed. For days afterward, he dreamed of the woman's face pressed to the crack in the boards, her pale eyes boring into him. In every dream, the lantern swung closer and closer, the wood groaned louder, until finally the board snapped. And when they did, the whisper of her voice would curl into his ear. You shouldn't have looked. Even awake, he said he sometimes caught the faint smell of kerosene or heard the sound of a creaking door when he was alone in his apartment. Luke admitted the same. Locals weren't surprised. They said the widow never forgave the world for leaving her alone in that cabin. They said she nailed those boards herself, trying to keep the grief locked in, but grief has a way of leaking through the cracks. And anyone who peeks inside is marked. The widow's cabin still stands in Pine Lick Hollow. Travelers sometimes report seeing the flicker of a lantern through the trees, even when they know the windows are sealed. Some claim to hear the faint sound of a woman crying, low and broken, drifting across the hollow. If you ever find yourself walking those trails, and you see a glow where no light should be, don't stop. Don't look. And whatever you do, don't get too close to the boards. Because if you meet her eyes, she'll never let you go. Just outside the Tennessee foothills, where the Appalachian ridges slope down into farmland, there's an old white farmhouse locals call the Bell House. Not because of its shape or design, but because of the sounds people say they hear inside. If you walk past it at night, they claim you'll hear faint chimes, like bells swaying in a breeze that doesn't exist. The farmhouse has been abandoned since the early 80s. No one really remembers who lived there last, though rumors say a family vanished one winter, leaving their belongings behind as if they'd simply walked out and never returned. Since then, it's become a dare among teenagers. Spend a night in the Bell House and see if you can make it until dawn. If you do, 3 friends, Jenny, Mark, and Tyler, decided to try one summer. They were 17, reckless, eager to prove themselves braver than the others. They drove out on a humid evening, parking their car at the end of a gravel road and hiking through waist-high weeds until the house came into view. It was 2 stories, with a sagging roofline and windows shattered like broken eyes. The porch leaned forward, boards warped and black with rot. Jenny wrinkled her nose as they stepped up, muttering, "Smells like a barn in here." Tyler pushed the door, and it swung open with a shriek of rusted hinges. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the musk of mildew and animal nests. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, and the floor was littered with old newspapers, their ink smeared and unreadable. They set up flashlights, laughing nervously to hide their unease. For a while, it felt like any other old abandoned house. Quiet, empty, harmless. But around midnight, things changed. Jenny was the first to notice it. A sound, faint at first, drifting down the staircase. Chime, chime, chime. Soft, delicate, like little brass bells swaying somewhere just out of sight. "Do you guys hear that?" she whispered, eyes wide. Mark shrugged, trying to laugh it off, but when the sound came again, louder this time, all three of them froze. The bells weren't random. They had rhythm, like someone walking with them, each step making them sway. Tyler swallowed hard. It's probably wind, but the air inside the house was dead still. Curiosity got the better of Jenny. She took her flashlight and crept up the stairs, each step groaning beneath her weight. Mark and Tyler followed close, their beams trembling across the faded wallpaper. The sound of the bells grew louder, clearer, until it seemed to fill the entire upstairs hall. And then Jenny saw them. On a dust-covered dresser in the last room, a string of tarnished brass bells lay in a tangled coil. Her light caught the metal, making them glint faintly. They swayed back and forth though no hand touched them, ringing soft and sweet in the still air. "See?" Tyler whispered. "It's nothing." But before Jenny could reply, the floor beneath her shuddered, as if something heavy had stomped just behind her. She spun around, heart leaping in her throat. Her flashlight beam cut across the hall, but nothing was there. The bells rang louder, sharper, like they'd been struck hard by invisible fingers. The three of them bolted down the stairs, breath coming in ragged gasps. But halfway to the front door, the sound followed. The bells chimed in the parlor, in the kitchen, in every room at once, surrounding them. Jenny screamed, shoving open the door, and they tore into the night. The cicadas roared outside, the air hot and sticky, but none of them stopped running until they reached the car. When they finally looked back, the house was silent again. No bells, no light, nothing but a dark, sagging silhouette against the sky. That night should have been the end of it. But for Jenny, it wasn't. The bells came back. Not in the house, at home. She'd be lying in bed when she heard the faintest chime in her closet, or brushing her teeth when the sound rang softly from the hallway. She told her friends, but neither Mark nor Tyler admitted to hearing anything. Weeks later, Mark finally confessed. The bells had followed him, too. He heard them in his basement, faint but steady, always in the dark corners. Tyler never said much after that night, but his sister claimed he stopped sleeping, jumping at every sound until he left town for good. The farmhouse still stands in the Tennessee foothills. The boards are rotting, the roof nearly caved in, but the bells remain. Some say they belong to the missing family's youngest child, who wore them as toys around her wrist. Others whisper the family didn't vanish. They were taken, and the bells are all that remain of them. Whatever the truth, those who dare to enter the bell house don't stay long. The sound always begins faintly, like a breeze stirring metal. But the longer you listen, the louder it gets, until it's right beside you, ringing in your ear, urging you to run. And if you don't, no one really knows, because the only ones who return are the ones who ran. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, tucked behind walls of kudzu and pine, there's a house the locals don't even bother to point out on maps anymore. They call it the Frozen House because no matter what time of year you enter, the air inside hangs heavy with a bitter, unnatural cold. It's the kind of cold that clings to your skin, seeps into your bones, and refuses to let go. Most people steer clear of it, though teenagers sometimes dare each other to peek inside. But there's one man, Travis, who swore he set foot inside on a sweltering July afternoon, and what he experienced still haunts him to this day. Travis wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't out there chasing ghost stories for fun. He was a contractor, scouting remote land for potential buyers who wanted to build cabins. He'd grown up in the mountains and figured he'd seen it all. Sinkholes, rotting barns, black bears prowling the woods. But he hadn't seen the frozen house. Not until he followed a narrow dirt path down into a hollow, brush snagging at his jeans, cicadas screaming in the trees, the sun beating down hot enough to sting his neck. When he stumbled into the clearing, The house rose before him like a corpse. Its walls were veined with kudzu, windows shattered, roof sagging under the weight of years. He wiped sweat from his forehead, thinking it would be just another ruin to note in his survey. But the moment he stepped onto the porch, the temperature dropped. At first, he thought it was the shade. But it wasn't shade, it was something else. Something wrong. His breath puffed in the air, visible in pale streams. His hands went numb, stiff around the flashlight he carried. And yet outside, the air was thick with summer heat. Travis muttered to himself, "That's not possible," but pushed inside anyway. The living room was covered in a thick sheet of dust, furniture collapsing into itself. The wallpaper had peeled into curling strips, exposing what beneath that looked black with rot. But what unsettled him most were the mirrors. Nearly every wall had one, some cracked, some shattered, their shards glittering like ice. Every single mirror except one. At the end of the hall, hanging crooked but perfectly intact, was a tall mirror in a gilded frame. Its glass gleamed strangely clean, untouched by dust or time. Travis's boots crunched across the floor as he approached, his light flickering weakly against the cracked plaster walls. The air grew even colder, sharp enough to sting his lungs. When he stopped in front of the mirror, he expected to see his own reflection, a tall man, shoulders tense, face pale with unease. But the figure staring back wasn't him. It was a shadow, tall, thin, distorted, with arms that hung too long at its sides. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes black voids that seemed to burn holes straight through him. Travis spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but the hallway was empty. Nothing stood behind him. His flashlight beam bounced against peeling wallpaper, empty corners. Just silence. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure hadn't moved. Only now it was closer, right behind him. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. Travis bolted down the hall, boots thundering on the warped boards, his breath coming in frantic gasps. The air bit at his skin like frostbite, clawing at his arms, his neck. The whole house seemed to groan around him, as though the wood itself were alive, protesting his escape. He burst through the front door and stumbled onto the porch. The second he hit sunlight, the cold vanished. Just like that. His breath no longer fogged. His skin burned with sweat again, cicadas shrieking in the trees. He stood there, panting, staring at the house as if it had nearly swallowed him whole. That night, Travis tried to shake it off. Told himself it had been heat stroke, or maybe the shock of stepping into an air pocket cooled by underground springs. But when he went to bed, he dreamed of the mirror. In his dream, he stood in that hallway again. The glass gleamed. The shadow stood behind him, closer now. Always closer. He woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, frost clinging to his sheets as though he'd dragged the cold out with him. For weeks, the dream returned. Each time, the figure drew nearer. Each time, its head tilted further, bones cracking, as if preparing to press its face against his shoulder, to whisper something he couldn't yet hear. Travis stopped sleeping. He stopped working. Friends said he looked hollow, like he'd aged years in a matter of weeks. When they asked what was wrong, he only muttered, "It followed me out." And then, one night, he disappeared. His truck was found parked on the same dirt path, keys in the ignition, door hanging open. Search parties combed the woods, but no trace of him was ever found. What they did find, nailed to the wall inside the frozen house, was a new mirror, large, clean, gleaming. And when one deputy glanced into it, just for a second, he swore he saw Travis standing in the glass. Only not as himself, as a shadow, tall and thin, head tilted, watching with eyes like black voids. The frozen house still sits in the hollow, hidden under vines, colder inside than the mountain winter itself. Locals say the shadow lives in the mirrors, waiting for new eyes to look too long. And if you see it, if you meet its gaze, it follows you. First into your dreams, then into your waking life, until the day you vanish, leaving behind nothing but your reflection. So if you ever wander the Blue Ridge trails and stumble across a house wrapped in kudzu, do yourself a favor. Don't step inside. Don't even glance at the glass, because the cold is hungry, and once it finds you, it never lets go. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, tucked behind walls of kudzu and pine, there's a house the locals don't even bother to point out on maps anymore. They call it the Frozen House because no matter what time of year you enter, the air inside hangs heavy with a bitter, unnatural cold. It's the kind of cold that clings to your skin, seeps into your bones, and refuses to let go. Most people steer clear of it, though teenagers sometimes dare each other to peek inside. But there's one man, Travis, who swore he set foot inside on a sweltering July afternoon, and what he experienced still haunts him to this day. Travis wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't out there chasing ghost stories for fun. He was a contractor, scouting remote land for potential buyers who wanted to build cabins. He'd grown up in the mountains and figured he'd seen it all: sinkholes, rotting barns, black bears prowling the woods. But he hadn't seen the frozen house. Not until he followed a narrow dirt path down into a hollow, brush snagging at his jeans, cicadas screaming in the trees, the sun beating down hot enough to sting his neck. When he stumbled into the clearing, the house rose before him like a corpse. Its walls were veined with kudzu, windows shattered, roof sagging under the weight of years. He wiped sweat from his forehead, thinking it would be just another ruin to note in his survey. But the moment he stepped onto the porch, the temperature dropped. At first, he thought it was the shade. But it wasn't shade, it was something else. Something wrong. His breath puffed in the air, visible in pale streams. His hands went numb, stiff around the flashlight he carried. And yet outside, the air was thick with summer heat. Travis muttered to himself, "That's not possible," but pushed inside anyway. The living room was covered in a thick sheet of dust, furniture collapsing into itself. The wallpaper had peeled into curling strips, exposing wood beneath that looked black with rot. But what unsettled him most were the mirrors. Nearly every wall had one, some cracked, some shattered, their shards glittering like ice. Every single mirror except one. At the end of the hall, hanging crooked but perfectly intact, was a tall mirror in a gilded frame. Its glass gleamed strangely clean, untouched by dust or time. Travis's boots crunched across the floor as he approached, his light flickering weakly against the cracked plaster walls. The air grew even colder, sharp enough to sting his lungs. When he stopped in front of the mirror, he expected to see his own reflection, a tall man, shoulders tense, face pale with unease. But the figure staring back wasn't him. It was a shadow, tall, thin, distorted, with arms that hung too long at its sides. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes black voids that seemed to burn holes straight through him. Travis spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but the hallway was empty. Nothing stood behind him. His flashlight beam bounced against peeling wallpaper, empty corners. Just silence. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure hadn't moved. Only now it was closer, right behind him. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. Travis bolted down the hall, boots thundering on the warped boards, his breath coming in frantic gasps. The air bit at his skin like frostbite, clawing at his arms, his neck. The whole house seemed to groan around him, as though the wood itself were alive, protesting his escape. He burst through the front door and stumbled onto the porch. The second he hit sunlight, the cold vanished. Just like that. His breath no longer fogged, his skin burned with sweat again, cicadas shrieking in the trees. He stood there, panting, staring at the house as if it had nearly swallowed him whole. That night, Travis tried to shake it off, told himself it had been heat stroke, or maybe the shock of stepping into an air pocket cooled by underground springs. But when he went to bed, he dreamed of the mirror. In his dream, he stood in that hallway again. The glass gleamed. The shadow stood behind him, closer now, always closer. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, frost clinging to his sheets as though he'd dragged the cold out with him. For weeks, the dream returned. Each time, the figure drew nearer. Each time, its head tilted further, bones cracking, as if preparing to press its face against his shoulder, to whisper something he couldn't yet hear. Travis stopped sleeping. He stopped working. Friends said he looked hollow, like he'd aged years in a matter of weeks. When they asked what was wrong, he only muttered, it followed me out. And then, one night, he disappeared. His truck was found parked on the same dirt path. Keys in the ignition, door hanging open. Search parties combed the woods, but no trace of him was ever found. What they did find, nailed to the wall inside the frozen house, was a new mirror. Large, clean, gleaming. And when one deputy glanced into it, just for a second, he swore he saw Travis standing in the glass. Only not as himself. As a shadow, tall and thin, head tilted, watching with eyes like black voids. The frozen house still sits in the hollow, hidden under vines, colder inside than the mountain winter itself. Locals say the shadow lives in the mirrors, waiting for new eyes to look too long. And if you see it, if you meet its gaze, it follows you. First into your dreams, then into your waking life, until the day you vanish, leaving behind nothing but your reflection. So if you ever wander the Blue Ridge trails and stumble across a house wrapped in kudzu, do yourself a favor. Don't step inside. Don't even glance at the glass. Because the cold is hungry, and once it finds you, it never lets go. And if you're foolish enough to step inside, to let those glass eyes rest on you for too long, they'll follow. Maybe not in your car, maybe not right away. But sooner or later, you'll hear the creak of a rocking chair in the dark. And when you turn on the light, one of them will be waiting. On the very edge of the Appalachian foothills in Ohio sits a house that locals don't just avoid. They cross the road to keep their distance. It's not crumbling like most abandoned farmhouses, not overgrown or collapsing. No, this one looks intact, preserved, as though time itself refuses to touch it. The boards are straight, the paint is pale and unchipped, the windows spotless. Yet the silence around it is what unsettles people the most. Not a bird sings near it, not a cricket chirps in the weeds. Even the wind seems to hush as it moves past, leaving the house in a bubble of dreadful quiet. That's why they call it the Silent House. The story goes that no one has lived there in nearly a century. The last family to occupy it, a man, his wife, and 2 children, vanished without a trace one autumn night in the 1920s. Dinner was still on the table. The beds were neatly made, doors unlocked, but the family was gone, as if they'd dissolved into the stillness that surrounds the place. Since then, the house has stood like a monument to absence, drawing in the curious and the reckless. One of those was a man named Eddie, a retired truck driver with a taste for ghost hunting. He'd heard stories about the Silent House his entire life, but never dared to see it for himself until the fall of 1997. He was in his 40s then, tired of living cautiously, eager to prove he wasn't afraid of the old legends. With only a flashlight and a camcorder, he set out one October evening, determined to spend the night inside. The gravel road crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward it, the air heavy and cold. Already, the silence pressed on him like a weight. No cicadas sang in the trees. No dogs barked from distant farms. Even his own breathing sounded too loud in his ears, as if the air itself was amplifying his presence. He climbed the porch steps and paused. The boards didn't creak. They didn't move at all. They felt solid, too solid, as though frozen in place. With a deep breath, Eddie twisted the knob and stepped inside. The interior was immaculate. No dust, no cobwebs, no sign of rot. The wooden floors gleamed faintly in the beam of his flashlight, and the wallpaper, though old-fashioned, looked fresh, unstained. It was as though the house had been locked in the very moment the family disappeared. Chairs sat tucked neatly beneath the table. China rested in a cabinet, its glass doors spotless. But the silence, God, the silence. Eddie whispered into his camcorder, narrating as he moved through the rooms. Everything's clean, too clean, like someone just left. His voice echoed faintly, though there was nothing for it to bounce off. He tried to comfort himself with the hum of the camcorder, but even that seemed muted, swallowed by the house's still air. Upstairs, he found the children's bedrooms. Toys lay neatly arranged on shelves. A wooden rocking horse sat in the corner, glossy and untouched. Eddie crouched down to film it, then froze. The horse rocked, just slightly, as if nudged by a breeze. But there was no breeze. The windows were shut tight, the air unmoving. Slowly, steadily, the horse tilted forward again. Eddie's hand shook as he lowered the camera. "Hello." His voice cracked in the silence. No answer. He backed out of the room, heart pounding, and made his way into the master bedroom. There, on the dresser, he saw something strange. 4 silver spoons arranged in a line, polished so brightly they glimmered in his flashlight beam. He frowned, leaning closer. They were perfectly parallel, no dust between them. And as he leaned in, he noticed his reflection in the spoons, distorted, warped. His eyes looked too large, his mouth too wide. Eddie recoiled, muttering to himself, "Don't lose it, man. Don't lose it." He tried to distract himself by setting up his gear in the parlor. He placed the camcorder on a tripod, aimed at the staircase, then settled into a chair. Midnight crept in slowly. The house remained silent. His eyelids grew heavy, lulled by the stillness. Then a sound, not loud, but sharp against the quiet. Tap, tap, tap. Eddie snapped awake, eyes darting to the staircase. His camcorder light glowed faintly, catching movement. Something was descending the stairs. At first, he thought it was just a trick of light. But as the figure came into focus, his blood ran cold. It was a child, a small boy, maybe 8 or 9, dressed in old-fashioned pajamas. His face was pale, expression blank, eyes hollow. He stepped down the stairs slowly, barefoot, tapping each step with his heel. Eddie whispered, "Jesus Christ." His voice was barely audible, but the boy stopped. Slowly, mechanically, the child turned his head toward Eddie and smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a mischievous one. It was empty, cold. The camcorder caught every second as Eddie scrambled to his feet. But when he looked back at the stairs, the boy was gone. The silence returned, heavier than before. Eddie bolted. He didn't grab the camcorder. He didn't look back. He raced out the front door, down the porch steps, and into the night, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. Only when he reached his truck did the silence break. The crickets returned. The wind whispered through the trees, the world alive again. The camcorder was later found by another group of explorers. They never found Eddie. His truck sat abandoned on the road for days before police hauled it away. But Eddie himself vanished, just like the family before him. Locals say the silent house doesn't want visitors. It keeps what it likes, swallows them whole, erasing their presence from the world outside. That's why the air is so still, why the silence is so thick, because everything inside is listening, waiting. And if you ever find yourself walking that gravel road at night, and you notice how quiet it suddenly becomes, turn back. Don't look at the windows. Don't step onto that porch. Because once you enter the silence, it may never let you go. Deep in the hollows of West Virginia, where the roads narrow to little more than dirt tracks and the forest presses in so close it blots out the sky, there's a house that locals call the Mirror House. It's not large, not impressive, just another 2-story farmhouse with a sagging porch and a roof nearly torn away by storms. But the name comes from what's inside. Every wall, every room, every surface is covered in mirrors. No one knows who lived there last, but neighbors tell stories of a reclusive man, a collector, who lined his home with glass so he could watch himself from every angle, as though terrified of missing a single moment of his own life. Others whisper that he was obsessed with capturing spirits, that mirrors are gateways, and he hoped to trap something inside. Whatever the truth, the house has been empty for decades, though the mirrors remain. It was in 2005 when 3 college students from Charleston decided to explore it. Their names were Chris, Jenna, and Miles. They were amateur paranormal investigators, armed with cheap cameras, digital recorders, and more confidence than sense. The road to the house was barely a road at all, winding through endless trees until it narrowed to a footpath. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the forest unnaturally still. When they finally stepped into the clearing, the house rose before them, a hollow shell of rotting wood and broken windows. Yet when the late afternoon sun struck its interior through those shattered panes, light gleamed off countless points within, like the place was full of eyes. Chris grinned. trying to mask his nerves. Well, that's not creepy at all. Inside, the air smelled faintly metallic like blood and rust. Their flashlights swept across the walls, and everywhere they turned, mirrors stared back. Some were cracked, others whole, but all reflected their faces in distorted ways. Too long, too wide, or too dark, as if something beneath the surface was trying to stretch free. Jenna muttered, "Why would anyone live like this?" They pushed deeper into the house, the mirrors multiplying in every direction. In the parlor, the walls were completely covered, floor to ceiling, reflecting their lantern light into infinity. Each movement splintered into dozens of copies, making it impossible to tell where one reflection ended and another began. At first, it was almost fun. They laughed nervously, waving at their endless doubles, pretending to get lost in the maze of glass. But then Miles stopped. His face had gone pale. "Don't move," he whispered. Jenna frowned. "What?" He pointed at one of the mirrors. "Look." They turned and saw it. In the reflection, 3 figures stood. But in reality, there were only 2. The extra figure was blurry, pale, taller than the rest. Its face was smeared, as though the mirror couldn't quite hold it. Slowly, it leaned closer, pressing its distorted face against the glass. Chris swore and spun around, but the space behind them was empty. Only the mirror showed the figure, growing clearer as it moved, its mouth opening wide though no sound emerged. Jenna grabbed his arm. "We need to go. Now." But when they turned to leave, the hallway stretched impossibly long, mirrors on either side reflecting them in endless rows. Their own reflections didn't move in sync anymore. Some blinked too late, others smiled when they didn't. One tilted its head slowly, eyes gleaming in the lantern light. Panic rose in Chris's chest. He ran, dragging Jenna and Miles with him, the house groaning around them. But every corner led back to the mirrors, every door opening to another wall of distorted faces. And then the voices began, faint at first, whispering from the glass. Echoes of their own words, but twisted, cruel, mocking. Chris heard his own voice hiss, "You'll never leave." Jenna heard herself sobbing, though she hadn't cried. Miles heard laughter, his laughter high-pitched and hysterical. They stumbled into what must have been the master bedroom. The walls here were covered in floor-to-ceiling mirrors, all unbroken. For a moment, they stood still, gasping for air. Then Jenna screamed. Her reflection stepped out of sync. It smiled at her, though her real mouth was trembling. It raised its hand when hers didn't. And then, slowly, deliberately, it pressed its palm against the glass. The mirror rippled. Miles dropped the lantern, the flames sputtering. Darkness closed in, pierced only by faint glints from the mirrors. Reflections leaned closer, pressing against the glass, their faces wrong, too sharp, too wide-eyed, grinning with teeth too long. Something moved behind the glass. Dozens of pale hands slammed against it, smearing the surface with fog. The sound was deafening, 1,000 palms pounding at once. Chris grabbed the others, screaming, and they ran blindly through the dark. The house shifted around them, stairs leading nowhere, doors opening to walls of glass. Every mirror showed them running, but in the reflections, something always followed, just a step behind. Finally, by some miracle, they burst through the front door and into the night. The forest air hit their lungs like ice, alive with the sound of crickets once more. Behind them, the house stood silent. The mirrors glinted faintly in the moonlight, still and empty. They didn't speak on the drive home, but Chris noticed something in the rearview mirror that night. Not his own reflection, but someone else's. A pale figure, sitting in the back seat, smiling through the glass. He swerved, nearly crashing the car, but when he looked again, the back seat was empty. Over the weeks that followed, each of them saw things in mirrors. Chris claimed he saw hands brushing the inside of his bathroom mirror, dragging across the fog after a shower. Jenna said her reflection lagged behind her movements, smiling when she wasn't. Miles stopped answering their calls altogether. When Chris went to his apartment, the bathroom mirror was shattered, shards littering the floor, but Miles was gone. The Mirror House still stands in West Virginia, its walls lined with glass, waiting. Locals say the mirrors don't just reflect, they collect. Every person who looks too long leaves a piece of themselves behind. A fragment, a shadow, and sometimes that shadow doesn't want to stay trapped. So if you ever find yourself deep in those hollows, and the setting sun glints off glass where no house should be, don't go closer. Don't let those mirrors catch your face, because once they do, your reflection may not give you back. In the Appalachian stretch of Pennsylvania, just outside a coal town that burned itself into silence decades ago, there's a charred skeleton of a farmhouse people call the firehouse. Its blackened beams jut out like broken ribs, its windows melted into warped glass. The story is that it caught fire one winter night in the 1930s. Neighbors saw the flames light up the hills, but by the time they arrived, the house was nearly gone. The family inside, parents and 3 children, were found in the ruins. Some said they were already dead before the fire ever touched them. Others swore the fire started from the inside, a blaze that burned too hot, too fast to be natural. The place was left standing, half-burned, a grim reminder of tragedy. But over the years, those who dared step inside whispered the fire never truly went out. In 1994, a group of teenagers from a nearby town decided to explore the firehouse on Halloween night. There were 5 of them: Tom, Rachel, Danny, Lacey, and Pete. They were the kind of kids who chased fear for the thrill of it, sneaking into graveyards and abandoned mines. The firehouse was just another dare. The air that night was sharp with autumn cold, the moon pale above the black ridges. They crept through the weeds until the house appeared, its charred skeleton looming against the sky. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though the fire had died 60 years before. "Smells like a campfire," Danny joked, though his laugh was hollow. They stepped inside, boots crunching on ash that never seemed to fade. The walls were streaked black, beams sagging but stubbornly still standing. In the parlor, the ceiling had collapsed, revealing the skeletal remains of rafters above. Rachel swung her flashlight across the room, and for a moment, they all froze. The walls glowed faintly. At first, they thought it was their imagination, but as the light shifted, the blackened beams seemed to pulse with an ember-red glow, like coals buried deep in ash. Pete whispered, "It's still burning." They pressed on, laughing nervously to mask their unease. But the deeper they went, the hotter the air grew. Sweat gathered on their foreheads, breath coming fast, though no fire burned around them. In the kitchen, the old iron stove stood warped and blackened, its door hanging open. Tom bent to peer inside. A faint flicker of flame licked the darkness, though there was no wood, no fuel. Just fire burning in the empty cavity. Suddenly, the stove door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the walls. Rachel screamed. Lacey grabbed her arm, urging her toward the door, but before they could move, a sound rose in the house. Crackling. The crackle of flames spreading fast. Danny spun, flashlight beam jerking across the walls. Fire raced along the beams, blooming into orange tongues that licked the ceiling. The house filled with smoke, thick and choking. The teens coughed, covering their mouths, stumbling for the exit. But when they reached the door, it was gone. In its place was a wall of fire. Rachel shrieked, backing away. The heat was unbearable, the flames rushing closer. Yet as she stumbled into the corner, she realized something horrifying. The flames weren't touching the wood. The beams didn't burn. They only glowed, feeding the fire without ever being consumed. And then they saw them. Shapes in the fire. Figures, twisted and screaming. Faces contorted in agony. A man, a woman, 3 small children, all writhing in the flames, their mouths open in silent cries. Their eyes burned bright white, fixed on the intruders. Tom yelled, "Run!" They bolted up the staircase, though it sagged beneath their feet, smoke swirling thick around them. At the top, they stumbled into a bedroom. The walls blazed with fire, but in the center of a room sat a blackened crib. Inside, a doll melted slowly, its porcelain face dripping like wax, its glass eyes running down its cheeks. Rachel gagged, covering her mouth. But then the crib shook violently, and the doll sat up. Its ruined face twisted, and from its cracked mouth came a hiss that rose into a piercing wail. The teens fled down the hallway, coughing, eyes burning. The house roared around them, fire closing in on every side. Yet as they turned corner after corner, they realized the house was no longer the same shape. Rooms shifted, doors vanished, hallways stretched impossibly long. The fire chased them, whispering through the smoke. Voices, not flames. Voices. Help us. Stay with us. Burn with us. Rachel stumbled, nearly collapsing, but Tom yanked her up, dragging her forward. They burst into the parlor again and found the front door standing open. Beyond it, cool night air waited, the moon shining bright. They didn't hesitate. One by one, they sprinted out, tumbling into the grass. The moment they crossed the threshold, the fire was gone. The house stood silent, blackened and cold, its walls empty. No smoke, no flames, no heat. Just silence. They never spoke about that night again. Not all of them, anyway. Within a year, Pete stopped coming to school. Rumor was he'd started waking up with burns on his arms, fresh and blistering, though no fire touched his home. Lacey claimed she smelled smoke everywhere she went, even in her own bed at night. Danny swore he heard crackling when no one else did, flames roaring just behind his ears. Rachel disappeared one winter night. Her house burned to the ground, though investigators said there was no source for the fire. They never found her body. The firehouse still stands in Pennsylvania. Black, silent, waiting. Locals say the fire never ended. It only paused, simmering in the ashes, waiting for more fuel. And anyone who dares step inside gives it just what it needs. So if you ever see a ruin glowing faintly in the dark, turn back. Don't breathe in the smoke. Don't listen to the whispers. Because once the firehouse finds you, it won't stop until it pulls you into the flames forever. Deep in the northern hills of Georgia, where the Appalachian ridges roll down into endless valleys and mist clings to the treetops like a living thing, there's a house locals only whisper about. They call it the house on the hill. From the outside, it looks ordinary enough. 2 stories of pale wood, a sagging porch, broken shutters rattling in the wind. But the land it sits on feels wrong. No birds sing there. No deer graze near it. Even the crickets seem to fall silent when the wind carries over that porch. The house has been empty for over a century, and yet, every few years, someone claims to see a light in the upstairs window. A lantern glow, a flicker of movement behind the cracked glass. And those foolish enough to step inside, well, most don't stay long. Those who do, they're never the same again. The story of the house on the hill begins in the late 1800s, when it was built by a man named Elijah Boone. He moved there with his wife and 2 daughters, building the house himself, beam by beam, from the trees he felled on the land. Neighbors said he was a quiet man, reserved, but deeply devoted to his family. For a time, the Boones lived happily, farming the land and raising their daughters. But then something changed. The younger girl, Anna, fell ill. No doctor could explain it. She wasted away in her bed, pale and fevered, whispering about shadows moving in the corners of her room. She swore something stood at her window each night, tapping softly on the glass. Within months, she was gone. After Anna's death, Elijah stopped working the farm. He spent long hours in the woods, muttering to himself, returning home with strange bundles wrapped in cloth. His wife left soon after, taking their surviving daughter with her. She told the neighbors Elijah had gone mad, but she never made it far. The locals said they saw her running barefoot down the dirt road one night, screaming. She and her daughter were never seen again. Elijah lived alone in the house for another year. Then one day, smoke rose from the chimney, thick and black, choking the sky. When the neighbors finally worked up the courage to check, they found the house empty. Elijah was gone. The fire in the hearth had burned itself out, but the walls were stained with soot. In the upstairs room, where Anna had died, the wallpaper was scorched with handprints. Small, blackened hands pressed into the plaster, as if a child had clawed her way out of the flames. The house was abandoned after that. No one would buy it. No one would tear it down. The land felt cursed. And yet, in the decades that followed, people couldn't resist the dare. One of the most infamous accounts came from the 1970s, when two brothers, Mark and David Waller, decided to explore it on a summer night. They were young, reckless, the kind of boys who laughed at ghost stories. They hiked up the overgrown path to the hilltop just before midnight, flashlights in hand. The house loomed before them, its windows black as eyes, the porch sagging with rot. The moment they stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned, though neither of them had put weight on it yet. It was like the house knew they were coming. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and old wood. Dust coated everything, yet there were footprints already on the floorboards. Small ones, leading deeper into the house. "Kids must have been here," David muttered, though his voice cracked. They followed the prints into the parlor. The furniture was still there, an old sofa, a rocking chair, a table sagging in the middle. But everything was covered in a thick film of dust, as if time had stopped. The footprints ended at the staircase. And that's when they heard it. A creak, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. The brothers froze, flashlights trembling in their hands. Then came another sound, a child's laugh, faint but clear, drifting down the stairs. Mark forced a grin. Probably just some kids playing a trick. But when they climbed the staircase, the air grew colder. Their breath puffed in front of them, visible even in the dark. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors. The footprints continued, black against the dust, stopping at the last room on the right. Anna's room. They pushed the door open, and the smell hit them. Smoke, acrid and choking, though there was no fire. Inside, the wallpaper peeled in long strips, blackened with soot. And there, above the bed frame, the handprints were still burned into the wall. Small hands, dozens of them. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. The brothers spun, flashlights jerking wildly. The laughter came again, closer this time. But it wasn't just one laugh. It was two. Two children giggling in the dark. The light caught movement, shapes darting in the corners, too quick to see clearly. The room grew hotter, the air shimmering like heat over pavement. Then the bed frame began to smoke, charred wood blackening as flames licked up from nowhere. Mark screamed, shoving the door with his shoulder, but it wouldn't budge. David pounded on the wall, his fists hitting the handprints, and with each strike, the prints seemed to deepen, black ash flaking off onto his skin. The laughter twisted into screams. High-pitched, piercing screams that filled the room until their ears rang. The fire roared higher, smoke choking them. In a blind panic, David smashed the window with his flashlight, glass shattering outward. He dragged his brother through, both of them tumbling 2 stories into the grass below. When they looked back up, the room was dark. No fire, no smoke. Just empty windows staring down at them. They never went back. In fact, they moved out of Georgia within the year, leaving the memory of that house behind them. But neighbors whispered that Mark never truly escaped. He was found dead in his home years later, burned alive in his bed. The fire marshal said there was no source for the flames. His mattress was untouched. Only his body bore the burns. And David? He still lives, but he doesn't talk. Not about that night. Not about the laughter. He only warns people to stay away from the house on the hill. Locals say it still waits there, patient and hungry. They say Elijah Boone made a deal in those woods, trading his family for something darker, something that still lives in the walls of that house. And sometimes, on foggy nights, when the moon is high and the crickets fall silent, you can see a faint light glowing in the upstairs window. If you're foolish enough to climb the hill and step inside, maybe you'll hear them too. The laughter, the screams, the sound of small hands pressing against the walls. And maybe, just maybe, you won't come back. Because some houses in Appalachia don't just hold memories. They hold the dead. And they're always waiting for someone new to let them in.